Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe you're worth loving just as you are. Sometimes it takes finding someone who sees your heart before they see anything else. In the dusty town of Red Dust Crossing, Mabel Hart made a bold challenge outside Murphy's saloon. "If you're strong enough to lift me, you can have me." Every man had tried and failed. Then Boone Calder stepped forward. This quiet giant of a cowboy bent down and lifted her clean off the ground like she was light as air. The crowd went silent. Mabel's face turned red. What started as a dare became something neither expected. Boone had been watching her for weeks, seeing how she ran her ranch and never let loneliness break her spirit. This wasn't about strength. This was about a man who saw a woman's worth and a woman learning to trust again. But could two people who'd given up on love find courage to try once more? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted red dust, crossing in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden buildings that lined Main Street. This was cattle country, where the horizon stretched endless and the sky seemed bigger than anywhere else on God's green earth. The town had grown up around the railroad depot and Murphy's Saloon, becoming a natural stopping point for ranchers driving their herds to market and cowboys looking for honest work between seasons. Mabel Hart stood on her front porch, coffee mug warming her hands, watching the sun climb over the rolling hills that bordered her ranch. At 38, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet. Her auburn hair, streaked now with premature silver, caught the morning light as she surveyed the land that had become both her burden and her blessing. The Double H Ranch, named for her and her late husband Henry, sprawled across 800 acres of good grazing land, complete with a creek that never ran dry and enough timber to keep the house warm through winter. 3 years had passed since Henry's heart gave out during spring roundup, leaving Mabel with a ranch to run, debts to pay, and a loneliness that settled deeper into her bones with each passing season. She'd kept the place going through sheer determination and the help of 2 loyal ranch hands, but the work was getting harder and the bills weren't getting any smaller. Still, she'd built a reputation in Red Dust Crossing as a woman who could hold her own in any business dealing and wasn't afraid to speak her mind when the situation called for it. "Mrs. Hart, you want us to move those steers to the south pasture today," called Jake Morrison, her foreman, as he approached the house. Jake was pushing 60, weathered as old leather, and had worked for the Hart family since before Mabel married into it. His loyalty never wavered, even when the paychecks came later than they should. "That's the plan, Jake. The grass is better down there, and we need to save the closer pasture for when the weather turns." Mabel finished her coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. "I'll be riding out to check the fence line along Miller's Creek after I finish the books." Jake nodded and touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Tommy's already saddling the horses." He paused, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "Mrs. Hart, if you don't mind me saying, you've been working mighty hard lately. Might do you some good to get into town more often, see folks." Mabel smiled at the old cowboy's gentle concern. "I see plenty of folks, Jake. Every time I go to Murphy's for supplies or to the bank, I can't take 2 steps without someone wanting to chat about the weather or give me advice I didn't ask for. That's not what I mean, and you know it." Jake's weathered face creased with paternal worry. "You're still a young woman, Mrs. Hart. Henry wouldn't want you spending your days talking only to cattle and account books." The mention of Henry's name brought the familiar tightness to Mabel's chest, but she'd learned to carry that ache without letting it show. "Henry's been gone 3 years, Jake. I've got a ranch to run and bills to pay. That's enough to keep any woman busy." Jake clearly wanted to say more, but he knew better than to push when Mabel's jaw set that particular way. He tipped his hat again and headed toward the barn, where Tommy Rodriguez, her younger ranch hand, was indeed saddling the horses for the day's work. Mabel went back inside her house, where the account books waited on the kitchen table like patient but unwelcome visitors. The numbers told a story she didn't want to read. Mortgage payments behind by 2 months, feed bills mounting, and the banknote coming due in 6 weeks. She'd been putting off the inevitable conversation with Samuel Brewster at the First Bank of Red Dust Crossing, but time was running short. As she worked through the figures, her mind wandered to the town beyond her property lines. Red Dust Crossing had a rhythm all its own, centered around Murphy's Saloon, which served as unofficial town hall, social club, and entertainment center, all rolled into one. Patrick Murphy, a transplant from Boston who'd followed the railroad west 15 years ago, ran the establishment with the perfect balance of order and tolerance that kept cowpokes, merchants, and ranchers all drinking at the same bar. The saloon was where Mabel had first noticed the newcomer, though she'd never admit it to anyone. Boone Calder had drifted into town 3 months ago, looking for work and a place to land for a while. He was impossible to miss, 6 feet and 6 inches of solid muscle, with shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of whatever shirt he wore. His dark hair was always neat, his manner quiet and respectful, and he had a way of listening when other folks talked that made him popular with the older residents who appreciated good manners. What struck Mabel most about Boone wasn't his impressive size, but the careful way he moved, as if he were always conscious of taking up too much space. She'd seen him help Mrs. Patterson load her wagon without being asked, and he always held doors for ladies with a tip of his hat that reminded her of men from an earlier generation. He worked odd jobs around town, helping the blacksmith, loading freight cars, repairing roofs, and never seemed to lack for employment or respect from those who hired him. Mabel had caught herself watching him more than once when their paths crossed in town, but she'd quickly looked away before anyone could notice. She had no business noticing any man, let alone one who looked like he could break her in half without trying. The thought made her cheeks warm even now, alone in her kitchen, with only the numbers to witness her momentary lapse. A knock at the front door pulled her from her reverie. Through the window, she could see the slight figure of Nettie Patterson, her closest neighbor and the town's unofficial keeper of news and gossip. Nettie was past 70, sharp as a tack, and had appointed herself Mabel's unofficial guardian since Henry's passing. "Morning, Nettie," Mabel said, opening the door. "Coffee's still hot if you want some." "Don't mind if I do." Nettie bustled in, her bright eyes taking in the account books on the table. "Working on the ranch business, I see. How are things looking?" Mabel poured another cup of coffee and joined Nettie at the table, carefully closing the ledger first. "Same as always. We're managing." Nettie sipped her coffee and studied Mabel with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. "I was in town yesterday, picking up thread from Porter's store. Heard some interesting talk about a certain newcomer who's been asking questions about available land." "Lots of folks ask about land. It's good cattle country. This one's been asking specifically about the Double H." Nettie set down her cup with a decisive clink. "Boone Calder was talking to Samuel Brewster at the bank, wanting to know about properties that might be coming available soon." Mabel's stomach dropped. If Boone was talking to the bank about her ranch, then her financial troubles must be common knowledge in town. The thought of being the subject of sympathetic whispers and pitying looks made her want to crawl under the table. "Maybe he's just looking to buy land anywhere in the area," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Maybe." Nettie didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe he's sweet on a certain rancher lady and figures. The best way to help her is to be ready with a solution when she needs one." "Nettie Patterson, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." Mabel stood up abruptly, busying herself at the stove to hide her flaming cheeks. "I barely know the man, and he certainly doesn't know me well enough to be making any kind of plans involving my ranch." "Doesn't he?" Nettie's voice was gentle now, the teasing gone. "Honey, that man watches you every time you're in town. He's respectful about it, mind you, but his eyes follow you like a compass needle follows north, and I've seen you notice him noticing." Mabel turned around, coffee pot still in hand. "Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, it doesn't matter. I'm not in the market for a husband, and I certainly don't need some stranger thinking he can ride in and solve my problems. Nobody said anything about husbands or solving problems. Nettie stood up, smoothing her skirts. But sometimes the good Lord sends help in packages we don't expect. Might be worth considering whether you're being proud or just being wise. After Nettie left, Mabel found herself unable to concentrate on the account books. She kept thinking about Boone Calder, asking questions at the bank, about the way he always seemed to be around when she was in town, about the careful respect in his manner that never felt patronizing or pitying. She thought about his hands large and calloused from honest work, and wondered what it would feel like to have someone that strong choose to be gentle with her. The thought scared her more than the unpaid bills. 2 weeks later, the July heat pressed down on Red Dust Crossing like a wool blanket, making even the shade feel oppressive. Mabel had ridden into town to meet with Samuel Brewster at the bank, a conversation she'd been dreading but could no longer postpone. The meeting had gone exactly as she'd expected: polite concern, gentle reminders about overdue payments, and the unspoken threat hanging in the air like smoke from a campfire. "Mrs. Hart, you understand we don't want to see you lose the ranch," Brewster had said, his soft hands folded on the mahogany desk that had never known a day of honest work. "But the bank has obligations to its depositors. Perhaps it's time to consider your options." Mabel had kept her spine straight and her voice level throughout the conversation, but inside, she felt like a horse with a stone in its shoe. Every step painful, but stopping meant certain failure. She had 6 weeks to come up with 3 months' worth of payments, plus penalties, or the Double H would go up for auction. Now she stood outside Murphy's saloon in the blazing afternoon sun, her pride warring with her practical need for supplies. She'd spent her last ready cash on feed for the cattle, which meant putting the rest of her purchases on credit until she could figure out her next move. The thought of walking into Murphy's and asking to run a tab made her stomach churn, but the alternative was watching her livestock suffer. The saloon was busier than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Word of her meeting at the bank must have spread already. Nothing stayed secret long in a town the size of Red Dust Crossing. She could feel eyes on her as she pushed through the batwing doors, conversations pausing just long enough to let her know she was the subject of discussion. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hart," called Patrick Murphy from behind the bar. His Irish accent had softened over the years, but still colored his words with warmth. "What can I do for you today?" "Need to pick up some supplies, Patrick. Salt, sugar, coffee beans." She kept her voice steady, businesslike. "Wondering if I could settle up with you next week." Murphy nodded without hesitation. "Of course. No trouble at all. Your credit's always been good here." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Mabel blinked hard and turned to survey the saloon while Murphy gathered her supplies. The usual collection of cowboys and townsmen occupied the tables and bar, their conversations a low rumble, punctuated by the occasional laugh or curse. In the corner, old-timers played dominoes with the intensity of generals planning a battle. Well, if it isn't the lovely Widow Hart," came a voice that made Mabel's jaw clench. Silus Brock, the town's self-appointed ladies' man, approached with a swagger that owed more to whiskey than confidence. "Heard you might be looking for a business partner soon. I might be interested in discussing terms." Brock was the type of man who mistook persistence for charm and wouldn't take no for an answer without making the refusal as uncomfortable as possible. He'd been sniffing around the Double H since Henry's funeral, making increasingly bold suggestions about how he could help with the ranch work. "Not interested, Silus. Same as always." Mabel didn't bother to face him fully, keeping her attention on Murphy's methodical packaging of her supplies. "Now, Mabel, don't be hasty." Brock moved closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "A woman in your position can't afford to be too choosy. I've got money and experience, and I know how to handle livestock all kinds." The implication in his tone made several nearby conversations stop entirely. Mabel turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with warning. "My position, as you put it, is just fine. and I can handle my own livestock, thank you very much." "Can you, though?" Brock's voice rose, emboldened by his audience. "Word is the bank's getting mighty impatient about those payments. Might be smart to consider a partnership before you lose everything." The saloon had gone quiet now, everyone watching the confrontation with the uncomfortable fascination reserved for accidents and public arguments. Mabel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from pure, righteous anger. "Tell you what, Silus," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Since you seem so concerned about my ability to handle things on my own, let me make you a proposition." Brock's eyes lit up with anticipation. "I'm listening." Mabel stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. At 5 feet and 8 inches, with a figure that could generously be called abundant, she'd learned long ago that her physical presence was nothing to apologize for. Today, she decided to use every inch of it. "If you're strong enough to lift me clean off the ground," she announced, loud enough for everyone in the saloon to hear, "you can have me." The silence that followed was so complete that Mabel could hear the clock ticking behind the bar. Brock's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land, his whiskey-fueled confidence evaporating as he actually looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. That is Mabel. I didn't mean," he stammered. "Go ahead, Silus." Mabel's voice was honey over steel. "You wanted to handle me. Here's your chance." Brock glanced around the room, suddenly aware that every eye was on him. He'd backed himself into a corner with his big talk, and now he had to either accept the challenge or admit he'd been bluffing. His face turned red as he approached her, clearly trying to figure out the physics of the situation. He wrapped his arms around her waist and strained upward, his face turning redder with effort. Mabel's boots stayed firmly planted on the floor. After 30 seconds of grunting and pulling, he gave up, stepping back with sweat beading on his forehead. "Maybe I should wait until I haven't been drinking," he muttered, trying to save face. "Maybe you should," Mabel agreed pleasantly. "Anyone else want to try?" What happened next would be talked about in Red Dust Crossing for years to come. 3 more men stepped forward, cowboys who'd had enough beer to feel invincible. Each one tried and failed to budge Mabel more than an inch off the ground. The crowd was getting into it now, cheering and placing side bets on who might actually manage the feat. "This is ridiculous," Mabel said, but she was smiling now, enjoying the sight of these men who'd been making her life difficult, struggling with the reality of her challenge. "Is there anyone in this town who can actually—" "I'll try." The quiet voice cut through the noise like a knife. Every head turned toward the entrance, where Boone Calder stood in the doorway, the afternoon sun behind him, creating a silhouette that looked carved from the mountains themselves. He stepped into the saloon with the same careful grace Mabel had noticed before, but now there was something different in his bearing, a quiet determination that made the room hold its breath. Murphy's leather-bound bet ledger lay open on the bar, pages filled with wagers both serious and silly that had been recorded over the years. Patrick reached for his pen, sensing that this moment deserved documentation. "You sure about this, son?" asked one of the old-timers from the domino table. "That's a lot of woman there." Boone didn't answer. He simply walked across the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, until he stood directly in front of Mabel. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the honest scent of soap and leather and hard work that clung to him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat, "with your permission." Mabel's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the saloon could hear it. This close to Boone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the flutter of attraction mixed with genuine nervousness. But she'd made the challenge, and she wouldn't back down now. "Permission granted," she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Boone stepped even closer, close enough that she could see the concentration in his eyes. Then, with movements as gentle as they were confident, he placed one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. For just a moment, their faces were inches apart, and Mabel saw something in his expression that had nothing to do with showing off for the crowd. Then he lifted her, Not just off the ground, he swept her up, as if she weighed no more than a child, holding her securely against his chest with an ease that defied belief. The saloon erupted in cheers and applause, but Mabel barely heard it. All she could focus on was the gentle strength of his arms, the steady beat of his heart where her hand rested against his chest, and the way he was looking at her as if she were something precious he'd been waiting his whole life to hold. "Well," she managed to say, her voice slightly breathless, "I suppose that settles it." Boone's smile was soft and private, meant only for her. "I suppose it does, Ma'am." He held her for another moment longer than necessary to prove his point before gently setting her back on her feet. The crowd was still cheering, but Mabel felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. Murphy was scribbling furiously in his ledger, recording the bet and its surprising conclusion for posterity. As the noise died down and men began discussing what they'd just witnessed, Mabel found herself still standing close to Boone, neither of them moving away. The challenge had been met, the bet won, but suddenly the public nature of it all felt less important than the private understanding that seemed to be growing between them. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. "Thank you," he replied, and somehow she knew exactly what he meant. That evening, Mabel sat on her front porch, with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. The events at Murphy's saloon played through her mind like scenes from someone else's life. Had she really issued that challenge in front of half the town? Had Boone Calder really lifted her as if she were made of feathers and moonlight? The memory of his arms around her made her cheeks warm. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be held by a man, to feel small and protected, instead of always being the one everyone else leaned on. For those brief moments in Boone's embrace, she'd felt something she thought had died with Henry, the flutter of possibility, the whisper of what if. But the sensible part of her mind, the part that had kept the ranch running and the bills mostly paid for 3 years, was already building walls against such foolishness. Boone was a drifter, a man with no roots and no reason to stay in Red Dust Crossing once the novelty wore off. She was a widow with debts and responsibilities, hardly the type to sweep a man off his feet, even if she'd wanted to try. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her, brooding. Jake emerged from the gathering dusk, riding back from checking the fence line along the eastern border. He dismounted near the porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Evening, Mrs. Hart. Heard there was some excitement in town today," Mabel sighed. "Of course, word had already reached the ranch. I suppose everyone's talking about it. Can't say I blame them." Caused quite a stir from what Tommy heard at the feed store. Jake climbed the porch steps and settled into the chair beside her, groaning slightly as his joints protested the movement. "Want to tell me what possessed you to make such a challenge?" Silus Brock was being his usual charming self. "I got tired of his suggestions about handling my business." Mabel took a sip of her cold coffee and made a face. "Seemed like a good way to shut him up. And it worked, by all accounts, though I don't reckon you expected young Calder to step up like he did." The way Jake said it made Mabel look at him sharply. "What do you mean? Just that a man doesn't risk making a fool of himself in front of a crowd unless he's got good reason. And lifting a grown woman isn't something you attempt unless you're pretty sure you can manage it." Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Mabel caught the underlying message. "You think he was planning this? I think that boy's been watching you for weeks, taking note of how you move, how you carry yourself. I think he's been waiting for his chance to show you what kind of man he is." Jake stood up, preparing to head home to his own small cabin on the property. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" After Jake left, Mabel went inside and tried to focus on her evening routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the afternoon. She found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom, really looking at herself for the first time in months. The woman staring back had laugh lines around green eyes that still held warmth, auburn hair that caught the lamplight, and a figure that might be generous but was undeniably feminine. She'd been thinking of herself as dried-up widow for so long that she'd forgotten she was still a woman with a woman's needs and desires. On the dresser beside the mirror sat a daguerreotype of her and Henry on their wedding day, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera with the confidence of young people who believed their love could conquer anything. Next to it was a smaller photograph of Henry alone, taken just months before his death, his face already showing the strain that would soon stop his heart. Mabel picked up the wedding photograph, tracing Henry's face with her finger. He'd been a good man, steady and kind, and she'd loved him with the comfortable affection of a woman who'd married her best friend. Their love had been built on shared dreams and mutual respect, growing deeper over the years like a well-tended garden. But what she'd felt in Boone's arms that afternoon was something entirely different, wild and unexpected as a summer storm. It frightened her as much as it thrilled her, this reminder that her heart was capable of more than she'd allowed herself to remember. "What am I supposed to do, Henry?" she whispered to the photograph. "You always knew what was right." The photograph offered no answers, but somehow she felt a loosening in her chest, as if Henry himself were giving her permission to consider possibilities beyond grief and duty. The next morning brought no relief from the heat, and Mabel was grateful for the early hour as she saddled her horse for the ride to check the creek that watered her cattle. The morning chores helped settle her mind, the familiar routine of ranch work providing an anchor against the confusion of her emotions. She was surprised to find Boone waiting by the creek when she arrived, his own horse grazing nearby. He was examining the wooden frame of a gate that controlled water flow to different sections of the pasture, his large hands gentle as he tested the hinges. "Morning," he said, touching his hat brim as she dismounted. "Hope you don't mind me being here. Jake mentioned yesterday that this gate's been giving you trouble." Mabel felt a flutter of irritation. "Jake had no business discussing my ranch problems with you." "No, ma'am, I suppose he didn't." Boone's voice was mild, unoffended by her sharp tone. "But the gate still needs fixing, and I know something about carpentry. Thought I might help if you'd allow it." He'd already laid out a collection of tools on a worn canvas, tarp saws, chisels, a plane, and other implements that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Among them was an old blacksmith's hammer, its handle worn smooth by decades of use, and its head still true, despite obvious age. "That's a fine hammer," Mabel said, her curiosity overcoming her defensiveness. Boone picked up the tool, weighing it in his hand with obvious affection. "It was my father's. He was a blacksmith back in Missouri before he took up farming. Taught me that good tools deserve respect, and honest work deserves good tools." "What happened to the farm?" "Drought took 3 years running. Bank took the rest." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Mabel heard the pain underneath. "Pa died the winter after we lost the place. Ma followed him the next spring. Couldn't bear to live without him, I think." "I'm sorry. That must have been hard. Life's hard for most folks, one way or another." Boone set the hammer down carefully. "Question is what you do with the time you're given." They worked together in comfortable silence, Boone's skilled hands quickly identifying and fixing the problems that had been plaguing the gate mechanism. Mabel found herself studying his movements, noting the economy and precision that marked a man who'd learned his skills through necessity rather than hobby. There was something deeply attractive about competence, she realized, about watching someone solve problems with quiet confidence. "You're good at this," she said, as he planed a warped board to true straightness. "My pa always said a man should be useful. If you can fix things that are broken, build things that are needed, and leave places better than you found them, you've earned your keep in the world. Is that why you drifted this way, looking to be useful?" Boone paused in his work, considering the question. "Partly. Been moving around since I lost the family place, working where work was needed. But I've been thinking lately that maybe it's time to stop moving." The implication hung in the air between them like morning mist. Mabel felt her heart speed up, but forced herself to keep her voice level. "This is good cattle country. A man with skills could make a living here." "That's what I'm hoping." He resumed his planing, but she caught the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. Course, it'd depend on being welcome in the community. I think most folks would welcome a man willing to work hard and deal fairly. Most folks, maybe, but there's one person whose opinion matters more than the rest. Mabel felt heat rise in her cheeks. The conversation was heading into territory that both thrilled and terrified her. Boone, Mrs. Hart, I want you to know I didn't intend any disrespect yesterday. When I lifted you, He stopped, struggling with words. I've been watching you for weeks, seeing how you handle yourself, how you treat people, how you never let hardship break your spirit. When that fool Brock was bothering you, it made me angry. And when you made that challenge, I couldn't stand the thought of some unworthy man putting his hands on you. The honesty in his voice made something flutter in Mabel's chest. So you thought you were worthy? No, ma'am. But I thought I might try to become worthy, if you'd give me the chance. Before Mabel could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Jake and Tommy were riding hard across the pasture, their urgency obvious even at a distance. Mrs. Hart, Jake called as they drew near. We've got trouble. That new bull we bought last month, he's down, and he's down bad. The bull was indeed down, lying on his side in the shade of a cottonwood tree, his massive chest heaving with labored breaths. Mabel knelt beside the animal, running her hands along his neck and flanks, feeling for fever or signs of injury. The bull had cost her most of her remaining cash reserves, a necessary investment in improving her herd, but one that would be devastating to lose. When did you find him like this? She asked Jake, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. About an hour ago. Tommy and I were moving the herd to fresh grass when we noticed he wasn't with them. Found him here, barely able to lift his head. Mabel continued her examination, noting the animal's elevated temperature and the swelling in his legs. Looks like he got into some bad water or poisonous plants. Could be bloat, could be worse. Want me to ride for Doc Patterson? Tommy asked. The veterinarian lived 15 miles away, and in this heat, the round trip would take the better part of the day. Do it, Mabel said, though she knew that by the time the doctor arrived, it might be too late. A bull this size represented not just money, but the future of her breeding program. Without him, she'd have to send her cows to other ranches for breeding, an expensive proposition that would eat into already thin profits. Boone had been standing quietly to one side, studying the animal with the same careful attention he'd given the broken gate. Now he approached slowly, his movements calm and deliberate to avoid startling the sick bull. Ma'am, if I might make a suggestion. Mabel looked up at him, desperate enough to consider any option. I'm listening. I've seen this before. Bull got into some Jimson weed down in Texas. The swelling, the fever, the way he's breathing, it all matches. Boone knelt beside the animal, his large hands gentle as he examined the bull's gums and eyes. If it is Jimson weed poisoning, we need to get him on his feet and moving, get his circulation going. Otherwise the toxins will settle in his system. That's a 1,200-pound bull, Jake pointed out. He's not exactly in a mood to take a walk. No, but we might be able to encourage him. Boone stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. I'll need ropes, some grain to tempt him with, and every man you can spare. For the next hour, they worked with the patience of saints and the desperation of people who couldn't afford to fail. Boone directed the effort with quiet authority, positioning the men to lift and support the bull while using grain and gentle pressure to encourage the animal to stand. It was back-breaking work in the blazing heat, but gradually the bull began to respond. When the massive animal finally lurched to his feet, swaying but upright, Mabel felt tears of relief prick her eyes. They'd spend the rest of the day walking him slowly around the pasture, letting the movement help his system process whatever he'd ingested. But the crisis had passed. How did you know? She asked Boone as they watched Jake and Tommy lead the bull in a slow circuit around the water tank. Worked for a rancher in Texas who lost 3 head before we figured out what was happening. Some lessons you don't forget. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Course, I could be wrong, but it seemed worth trying. You probably saved his life. I can't afford to lose that bull. Something in her voice must have revealed more than she intended, because Boone gave her a sharp look. Things that tight? Mabel hesitated, then decided there was no point in pretending. Half the town already knew about her troubles anyway. Tight enough. Banknotes coming due in 5 weeks, and I'm 3 months behind on payments. That bull represents a significant investment. What happens if you can't make the payment? Auction. Everything goes: the ranch, the cattle, the house, everything Henry and I built together. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but there was also relief in saying them aloud. Boone was quiet for a long moment, watching the bull take his careful steps around the pasture. Might be I could help with that. I don't take charity. Wasn't offering charity. Was thinking more of a partnership. Mabel felt her spine stiffen. If this is about yesterday, about what happened at Murphy's, it's about a woman who knows how to run a ranch and a man who knows how to work. It's about good land and honest effort and building something that lasts. Boone's voice was steady, matter of fact. I've been saving money for 3 years, looking for the right place to settle down. Maybe I found it. You don't know me well enough to make that kind of decision, don't I? He turned to face her fully, his brown eyes serious. I know you get up before dawn to tend your animals. I know you pay your bills even when it hurts, and you treat your workers fairly, even when money's short. I know you've kept this place running for 3 years without a partner, which tells me you're stronger than most men I've met. Mabel felt heat flood her cheeks. That's not the same as knowing someone well enough to go into business with them. Then maybe we should work on getting to know each other better. Before Mabel could respond, Jake approached with news that the bull was walking steadier and seemed to be improving. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger problems, the bank payment, the ranch's precarious finances, and the growing tension between Mabel and Boone remained unresolved. That evening, Mabel sat at her kitchen table with a wooden recipe box open before her. The box had belonged to Henry's mother, passed down when they married, and was filled with handwritten cards detailing everything from Sunday pot roast to Christmas cookies. She'd been meaning to organize the recipes for months, but tonight she found herself drawn to them for a different reason. The recipes represented more than just meals. They were a record of a life built around family and home, traditions passed from mother to daughter-in-law, the kind of domestic knowledge that assumed a woman would have someone to cook for. Since Henry's death, Mabel had simplified her meals, cooking only what was necessary for survival rather than pleasure. Now, running her fingers over cards written in careful copperplate script, she found herself imagining what it might be like to cook for someone again, to plan meals around another person's preferences, to take pleasure in setting a table for 2 instead of eating standing up at the counter. The thought both attracted and frightened her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Through the window, she could see Boone's silhouette on the porch, hat in hand. Her heart began beating faster as she rose to answer. "Evening," he said when she opened the door. "Wanted to check on the bull before I headed back to town. He's doing much better. Jake's keeping an eye on him, but I think he's going to be fine." "Good, that's good." Boone shifted his weight, clearly working up to something. "Mrs. Hart, I hope I didn't speak out of turn earlier. About the partnership, I mean. You have every right to make suggestions. It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from the kitchen. "Would you consider letting me court you properly? Nothing presumptuous, just the chance to spend time together, let you get to know me better." The directness of the question took Mabel's breath away. In her experience, men usually approach such topics sideways, through hints and implications, rather than honest statements of intent. "I'm not sure I'm ready for courting," she said carefully. "Then maybe we could start with friendship. I could help around the ranch when you need it, share meals sometimes, just spend time together. No pressure, no expectations beyond getting to know each other." Mabel looked at this large, gentle man standing on her porch, offering her something she hadn't realized she missed until this moment: companionship. Not the burden of managing another person's needs and expectations, but the simple pleasure of sharing daily life with someone who understood the rhythms of ranch work and the satisfaction of honest labor. "I suppose friendship couldn't hurt," she said finally. Boone's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Hart. Mabel, if we're going to be friends, you might as well call me Mabel." "Mabel," he said her name like he was tasting something sweet. "I'd be honored." After he left, Mabel returned to the recipe box, but now the cards held different possibilities. She found herself wondering what Boone might like for breakfast, whether he preferred his coffee strong or mild, if he had a sweet tooth that might appreciate her late mother-in-law's apple pie recipe. For the first time in 3 years, she was thinking about cooking for the pleasure of it rather than the necessity. The realization both thrilled and terrified her, because it meant she was already further down the path toward caring about Boone Calder than she'd been willing to admit. The friendship that developed over the following weeks surprised Mabel with its ease and comfort. Boone began appearing at the ranch most mornings, offering help with whatever work needed doing. He never presumed or pushed, simply made himself useful in the quiet way that had marked all his actions since arriving in Red Dust Crossing. He repaired the corral fence that had been sagging for months, replaced loose shingles on the barn roof, and helped Jake move cattle between pastures with the skill of a man born to ranch work. In the evenings, he often stayed for supper, and Mabel found herself looking forward to these meals more than she cared to admit. Their conversations ranged from practical matters, the best methods for treating cattle ailments, the wisdom of planting winter wheat in the South Field, to more personal topics. Boone spoke of his childhood in Missouri, the lessons his father had taught him about craftsmanship and integrity, his dreams of building something permanent after years of drifting. Mabel shared stories of her early married life, the challenges of learning to run a ranch, the pride she felt in maintaining what she and Henry had built together. But the subject that cast a shadow over their growing friendship was the ranch's financial situation. With 3 weeks remaining until the bank payment came due, Mabel had exhausted every option she could think of. She'd sold off her best breeding stock at below-market prices, taken on additional work, breaking horses for neighboring ranches, and even considered selling her mother's silver service, a painful prospect that would have broken Henry's heart. The ranch deed lay on her kitchen table like an accusation, the legal language outlining her ownership of 800 acres that might soon belong to someone else. She'd read the document so many times that she'd memorized key phrases: granted and conveyed, to have and to hold, for the consideration of. Legal words that couldn't capture what the land meant to her, the sweat and dreams and determination that had made it home. "Mabel, you're wearing a groove in that floor," Jake observed one morning as she paced the kitchen while he finished his coffee. "This worrying isn't solving anything." "I know, but I can't seem to stop." She paused by the window, looking out at the pastures where her cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their home might soon be auctioned off. "There has to be something I'm missing, some option I haven't considered." "Well, there's one option you've been avoiding like it was a rattlesnake." Mabel didn't need to ask what he meant. Boone's offer of partnership had been hanging in the air for weeks, unspoken but not forgotten. She'd caught him studying her sometimes with an expression of patient hope, but he'd been true to his word about not pressuring her. "It's not that simple, Jake." "Seems simple enough to me. Man's got money, you need money. Man knows ranching, you know ranching. Man's sweet on you, and unless I'm blind, you feel something for him too. Feelings don't make a partnership work. What happens when the novelty wears off and he decides he wants to move on? What happens if things between us don't work out the way they're supposed to? What happens if you lose everything because you were too proud to accept help when it was offered?" Before Mabel could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. Through the window, she could see 2 riders coming up the lane, Samuel Brewster from the bank, and another man she didn't recognize. "Oh no," she whispered, her stomach dropping. "It's too early. They're not supposed to come for another 3 weeks." Jake stood up, his weathered face grim. Maybe they're just checking on the property. But even as he said it, they both knew better. Bankers didn't make social calls, especially not with witnesses in tow. Mabel smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the mirror by the door, steeling herself for what was coming. When Brewster's knock came, she answered with her chin up and her spine straight. "Mrs. Hart," Brewster said, touching his hat brim, "I hope we're not intruding. This is Mr. Aldrich from the territorial capital. He's here to assess the property." Aldrich was a thin, nervous man who clutched a leather portfolio like a shield. His eyes darted around the ranch yard, taking quick inventory of buildings, equipment, and livestock. It was the look of a man calculating values, and it made Mabel's skin crawl. "Assess it for what purpose?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Mrs. Hart, I'm afraid there's been a development. The bank's board of directors met yesterday, and they've decided to accelerate the timeline on delinquent accounts. I'm sorry, but we'll need payment in full by the end of next week, or we'll have to proceed with foreclosure proceedings." The words hit Mabel like a physical blow. Next week, not 3 weeks, not even 2 weeks, 7 days to come up with money she didn't have and couldn't possibly raise in time. "That's not what we agreed," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You said I had until the end of the month." "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Hart, but the bank's position has become untenable. We have our depositors to consider." Brewster's tone was apologetic but firm. "Mr. Aldrich is here to document the property's condition and prepare the auction materials." Aldrich stepped forward, consulting his portfolio. "I'll need to examine the house, outbuildings, and survey the land boundaries. This shouldn't take more than a few hours." "Now wait just a minute," Jake said, moving to stand beside Mabel. "Mrs. Hart's been dealing fairly with the bank for years. You can't just change the terms without proper notice. The terms of the original loan agreement allow for acceleration under circumstances of default," Aldrich said, in the dry tone of a man reading from a legal document. Mrs. Hart was given appropriate notice of her delinquent status. Mabel felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything she'd worked for, everything she and Henry had built together, was slipping away, despite her best efforts. The unfairness of it burned in her throat like bile. "Very well," she said finally. "Do what you need to do. But I want it on record that this ranch has been run honestly and maintained properly. Whatever value you place on it, it's been earned through hard work and fair dealing." As Aldrich began his assessment, making notes and sketches in his portfolio, Mabel retreated to the kitchen. She needed space to think, to process what had just happened and figure out her next move. But every option she considered led to the same dead end. She simply didn't have the resources to save the ranch on her own. The sound of another horse approaching made her look up from the deed she'd been staring at without seeing. Through the window, she saw Boone dismounting near the barn, his attention immediately drawn to the strangers examining his property. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders as he spoke briefly with Jake. A few minutes later, he knocked on her door, his expression serious. "Jake told me what's happening," he said without preamble. "Mabel, let me help, please." "It's too late for help. They want payment in full by next week." The words came out flat, defeated. "Even if I sold every head of cattle I own, I couldn't raise that kind of money in 7 days." "But I could." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Mabel looked at this man, who'd become so important to her daily life, who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, who was now offering to risk his savings for her sake. "Boone, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He stepped closer, his brown eyes intense with purpose. "I told you I'd been saving money for 3 years, looking for the right place to settle down. This is the place, Mabel. You're the reason I want to stay." "But what if things don't work out between us? What if you change your mind about wanting to stay? You'd have tied up all your money in my problems." "Our problems," he corrected gently. "And as for changing my mind, that's not going to happen. I'm not a man who makes decisions lightly, and I don't give my heart easily. But when I do, It's for keeps. The declaration made Mabel's breath catch. They'd been dancing around their feelings for weeks, but now he was laying everything bare with the same direct honesty that marked all his actions. "I care about you too," she whispered, "more than I thought I was ready to. But caring isn't enough to base a business partnership on." "Then what about this?" Boone pulled out a small object from his pocket, a wooden rose, carved with such delicate skill that it looked almost real. The petals were perfectly formed, each one distinct and graceful, and the stem was smooth as silk beneath her fingers. "You made this?" "Spent the last 2 weeks working on it in the evenings. Wanted to give you something that showed how I see you." His voice was soft, almost shy. Beautiful and strong, with hidden depths that only show themselves to someone who takes the time to look. Mabel turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the artistry and patience it must have required. This wasn't the work of an idle moment, but hours of careful craftsmanship, each cut of the knife deliberate and loving. "It's beautiful, Boone, but I can't." "Mabel," he took her hands in his, wooden rose and all, "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to let me help save your ranch, and in return, let me earn the right to court you properly. Let me show you what kind of partner I could be, in business, and maybe, if you're willing, in life." Through the window, she could see Aldrich measuring the front porch, reducing her home to numbers in his portfolio. In 7 days, all of this would belong to someone else, unless she swallowed her pride and accepted Boone's offer. But it wasn't just pride holding her back anymore. It was fear. Fear of depending on someone again, fear of the vulnerability that came with partnership, fear of losing herself in the needs and expectations of another person. "I need time to think," she said finally. Boone nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Of course, but Mabel, don't take too long. Time's the one thing we're running short of." The next 3 days passed in a blur of desperate activity. Mabel tried every possible solution she could think of, approaching other banks in neighboring towns, seeking buyers for her remaining cattle, even considering taking out loans against equipment and personal belongings. Each avenue led to the same conclusion: there wasn't enough time to raise the money she needed. Boone continued coming to the ranch each morning, working alongside Jake and Tommy as if nothing had changed, but Mabel could feel the weight of unspoken words between them. He didn't pressure her for an answer, but his presence itself was a constant reminder of the choice she faced. On Thursday evening, as they sat on the front porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mabel finally found the courage to voice her deepest fear. "What if I'm not good enough?" she asked quietly. Boone looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling, another small carving, this one taking the shape of a horse. "Good enough for what?" "For you, for a partnership, for anything beyond what I've already managed on my own." The words came out in a rush, 3 years of doubt and insecurity spilling over. "Henry and I, we grew up together. We learned to love each other gradually, based on friendship and shared dreams. But you're offering to risk everything for a woman you've known for a few months. What if you discover I'm not worth the investment?" Boone set down his carving and turned to face her fully. "Mabel, do you know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who gets up before dawn to tend to animals that depend on her. I see someone who pays her workers fairly, even when money's tight, who treats everyone with respect, regardless of their station. I see a person who's kept a ranch running for 3 years through drought, financial hardship, and personal loss, and who's done it without compromising her integrity or her kindness." His voice grew softer, more intimate. "I see a woman who makes the best coffee I've ever tasted, who knows the names of all her cattle, who can gentle a spooked horse with nothing but patience and soft words. I see someone beautiful and strong and worthy of every good thing life has to offer." Mabel felt tears prick her eyes. "But what if the sky falls? What if the creek runs dry? What if the sun forgets to rise tomorrow?" Boone's voice was gentle but firm. "Mabel, life doesn't come with guarantees. All we can do is make the best choices we can with the information we have, and trust that good intentions and honest effort will see us through. Is that what you're doing? Trusting? Every day since I met you. That night, Mabel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, turning Boone's words over in her mind. She thought about the years she'd spent building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the possibility of loss by refusing to let anyone get close enough to matter. It had been a successful strategy in its way. She hadn't been hurt, hadn't been disappointed, hadn't had to navigate the complex emotions that came with letting someone else share her life. But she also hadn't laughed much, hadn't felt the flutter of anticipation that came with planning something special for another person, hadn't experienced the deep satisfaction of shared accomplishment. She'd been surviving rather than living, existing rather than thriving. The wooden rose sat on her bedside table, catching moonlight from the window. She picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth petals, marveling again at the skill and patience it represented. This wasn't a gift given lightly or casually. It was a declaration of serious intent from a man who clearly didn't make such declarations often. Friday morning brought news that made her remaining time even more precious. Jake rode in from town with word that Samuel Brewster was planning to post auction notices that afternoon, announcing the sale of the Double H Ranch for the following Thursday. Once those notices went up, there would be no more extensions, no more negotiations, just the cold finality of legal proceedings. "Mrs. Hart," Jake said as she absorbed this latest blow, "I've known you since you were a bride, and I've watched you grow into one of the strongest women I've ever met. But strength doesn't mean you have to carry every burden alone." "I know that, Jake. I do. But accepting help means admitting you're human. It means recognizing that sometimes the best solutions come from working together instead of struggling alone." He paused, studying her face with the perception that came from decades of reading people and situations. "What are you really afraid of?" The question cut straight to the heart of her reluctance. Mabel sank into a chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 38 years. "I'm afraid of losing myself," she admitted. "When I married Henry, I was 19 and didn't really know who I was yet. I became his wife, learned to be the person he needed me to be. It was a good marriage, a happy marriage, but I was always somewhat in his shadow." She looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, the place where she'd learned to make decisions and live with the consequences. "These last 3 years have been hard, but they've also been mine. Every choice, every success, every failure, it's all been under my control. If I enter into a partnership with Boone, even a marriage, how do I know I won't just disappear again?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "Mrs. Hart, I knew your husband, and I know you. Henry was a good man, but he was also a man of his time, expected to be the head of the household, make the big decisions, set the direction for the family. But Boone's not Henry. How do you know?" "Because I've watched him work alongside you for weeks, and I've never once seen him try to take charge or override your judgment. He asks your opinion, follows your lead, treats you like a partner even when he's just helping out." Jake stood up, preparing to return to his morning chores. "That man doesn't want to absorb you, Mrs. Hart. He wants to complement you." That afternoon, as Mabel worked in her vegetable garden, a task that usually brought her peace, she found herself thinking about partnership in a different way. She'd been so focused on the risks and potential losses that she'd barely considered what she might gain. Shared decision-making meant shared responsibility, but it also meant shared success and the deep satisfaction of building something together. It meant having someone to celebrate with when times were good and someone to lean on when they weren't. It meant the possibility of growth and change and becoming more than she could be alone. Boone arrived that evening carrying his toolbox and a determined expression. "Thought I'd fix that loose step on the back porch," he said. "Been meaning to get to it for days." Mabel watched him work, noting again the quiet competence that marked all his actions. He didn't rush or take shortcuts, and he cleaned up his work area when he finished. These were small things, but they spoke to character and consideration for others. "Boone," she said as he packed up his tools, That offer you made, is it still open? He went very still, his hands pausing in their methodical organization of chisels and planes. Yes, I'd like to discuss terms. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. I'd like that very much. They sat at her kitchen table as the evening light faded, working out the details of their partnership with the same careful attention Boone brought to his carpentry. He would provide the money needed to satisfy the bank payment, becoming a full partner in the ranch operation. They would share decision-making authority, with Mabel maintaining her position as primary manager, given her experience and knowledge of the operation. "What about the personal side?" Mabel asked, when they'd covered the business aspects. "What are your expectations there?" "I'd like permission to court you properly," Boone said, his voice serious but warm. "To take time getting to know each other without the pressure of financial crisis hanging over us. To see if what we're feeling has the foundation to build something lasting on. And if it doesn't, if we discover we're not compatible in that way, then we remain business partners and hopefully friends. I'm not going to pressure you for something you can't freely give, Mabel. I want your heart, but only if you choose to offer it." The honesty and patience in his response settled the last of her fears. This was a man who understood that the best relationships were built on mutual respect and choice, rather than necessity or convenience. "Then yes," she said, extending her hand to shake on their agreement. "Partners." When Boone took her hand, he held it just a moment longer than business required, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was tender rather than possessive. "Partners," he agreed, "in all things, for as long as you'll have me." Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Mabel woke earlier than usual, energized by the relief of having made her decision and the anticipation of securing the ranch's future. She and Boone had agreed to meet at the bank when it opened on Monday morning to finalize the partnership and make the payment that would save the Double H. She was humming as she prepared breakfast, already planning improvements they could make to the ranch operation with their combined resources and knowledge. The financial pressure that had been crushing her for months had lifted, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years, genuine optimism about the future. The sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats interrupted her cheerful morning routine. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake riding hard across the pasture, his urgency obvious even at a distance. Behind him, a cloud of dust suggested more riders following. Mabel stepped onto the porch just as Jake reached the yard, his horse lathered with sweat and his weathered face grim with bad news. "Mrs. Hart, we've got trouble," he called, dismounting quickly. "Bad trouble. What is it? What's wrong?" Before Jake could answer, 3 more riders emerged from the dust cloud: Samuel Brewster, the bank assessor Aldrich, and Sheriff Tom Matthews. The presence of the sheriff sent ice through Mabel's veins. Law enforcement didn't get involved in routine foreclosure proceedings unless something had gone seriously wrong. "Mrs. Hart," Sheriff Matthews said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. There's been a development regarding your ranch that we need to discuss." Brewster stepped forward, his face pale and apologetic. "Mrs. Hart, I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a complication with the foreclosure proceedings. It appears there may be a prior claim on the property." "A prior claim? That's impossible. Henry and I have owned this land for 15 years. We have clear title." Aldrich consulted his ever-present portfolio, his nervous hands rustling through papers. "Ma'am, I've been researching the property records more thoroughly since our last visit, and I've discovered some irregularities in the original land grant. There's documentation suggesting that portions of your ranch may have been illegally sold." The words hit Mabel like physical blows. "What do you mean, illegally sold?" "It appears that the Territorial Land Office made an error when your husband purchased this property," Sheriff Matthews explained. "Some of these acres were already deeded to another party, a claim that predates your ownership by several years." "That's ridiculous. We've been paying taxes on this land, improving it, running cattle on it. No one's ever disputed our ownership before. Because the original claimant disappeared, Aldrich said, still shuffling through his papers. But he's recently returned to the territory and has filed a legal challenge to your ownership. His name is Marcus Thorne, and he has documentation supporting his claim to approximately half of your current holdings. Mabel felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Half the ranch that would include the house, the best pasture land, and the creek that watered her cattle. Even if she could somehow satisfy the bank payment, she might still lose everything to a legal challenge that should have been resolved decades ago. "Where is this Marcus Thorne now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "He's in the territorial capital, working with lawyers to formalize his claim," Sheriff Matthews replied. "The court has issued a preliminary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of the disputed property until the matter can be resolved." The implication hit her like lightning. Even if Boone had the money to pay off the bank, they couldn't use it to save the ranch because the property was now tied up in legal proceedings that could take months or even years to resolve. "Mrs. Hart," Brewster said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm afraid this means we can't accept payment on the mortgage until the ownership question is settled. The bank can't risk accepting money for property that may not legally belong to you. But it means the foreclosure proceedings are suspended indefinitely," Aldrich confirmed. "But it also means you can't sell, transfer, or mortgage the property until the courts determine who the rightful owner is." Mabel sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by this latest catastrophe. Just when she'd thought she'd found a solution, when she'd finally accepted help and opened her heart to the possibility of partnership, everything had been torn away by circumstances completely beyond her control. "How long could this take?" she asked quietly. "Territorial courts are notoriously slow," Sheriff Matthews admitted. "Could be 6 months, could be 2 years. There's no way to know." After the officials left, promising to keep her informed of any developments, Mabel sat alone on her porch in stunned silence. The ranch spread before her, looking exactly as it had that morning, the same rolling pastures, the same sturdy buildings, the same cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. But now all of it felt insubstantial, like a mirage that might disappear at any moment. Jake approached cautiously, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hart, what do you want me to tell the boys? Do we keep working like normal?" "I don't know, Jake. I honestly don't know what we're supposed to do now." The sound of another horse approaching made them both look up. Boone was riding across the pasture, having obviously seen the official delegation leaving the ranch. His face was set in grim lines, but his eyes were filled with concern rather than anger. "Mabel," he said as he dismounted, "Jake told me what happened. I'm sorry. Are you?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but the pain and frustration of the morning had to go somewhere. "This is your chance to back out gracefully. The ranch might not even be mine to partner with." Boone studied her face for a long moment, his brown eyes serious. "Is that what you think? That I'd abandon you the moment things got complicated? I think you'd be smart to. You came here looking for a stable investment and a place to build a future. Neither of those things exist here anymore." "Mabel," he stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I didn't offer to partner with your ranch. I offered to partner with you. There's a difference. But the money you're savings, there's no point in risking it now, when we can't even use it for its intended purpose." "Can't we?" Boone tilted his head, considering. "Seems to me the court said you can't sell or transfer the property, but they didn't say you couldn't continue operating it. Cattle still need feeding, fences still need mending, bills still need paying. But what's the point if we might lose everything anyway? The point is that you don't stop living just because the future's uncertain. The point is that you keep fighting for what matters to you, and you don't face the fight alone if you don't have to." Mabel felt tears prick her eyes. After a morning of devastating news and official sympathies, Boone's quiet steadfastness was almost more than she could bear. "You could lose everything," she whispered. "So could you. But we could also win everything together." He reached out to touch her hand, his fingers warm and strong against her cold ones. "Mabel, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes, we'll face it as partners. Even if the courts rule against me, even if this Marcus Thorne takes half the ranch, even then, we'll figure out how to make the remaining half profitable, or we'll find other land, or we'll start over completely if we have to. But we'll do it together. The certainty in his voice, the unwavering commitment to their partnership despite circumstances that would send most men running, finally broke through the walls around Mabel's heart. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore, it was about choosing to trust someone completely, to believe that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. "All right," she said, squeezing his hand. "Partners, no matter what." "No matter what," he agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and determination, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. The weeks that followed the legal bombshell tested every aspect of Mabel and Boone's developing partnership. Unable to resolve the mortgage situation, but determined to keep the ranch operational, they threw themselves into the daily work with renewed intensity. Boone moved his few belongings from the boarding house in town to the small cabin that had once housed the ranch's previous foreman, making their partnership official in the eyes of the community. True to his word, he provided the money needed for immediate expenses, feed, supplies, wages for Jake and Tommy, treating it as an investment in their shared future rather than charity. Mabel struggled with accepting this generosity at first, but gradually learned to see it as Boone did, the natural contribution of a partner who happened to bring financial resources to their collaboration. Their personal relationship deepened as naturally as their business partnership. Boone's quiet courtship consisted of small, thoughtful gestures that showed his attention to her preferences and needs. He brought her wild flowers from the meadow, carved small animals for her to place on the kitchen windowsill, and listened with genuine interest when she shared her dreams for improving the ranch operation. Mabel found herself looking forward to their evening conversations on the front porch when the day's work was done, and they could sit together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. These were the moments when their friendship transformed into something deeper, built on mutual respect and growing affection. But always hanging over their happiness was the uncertainty about the ranch's future. Letters from lawyers arrived sporadically, filled with legal language that boiled down to the same message. The case was proceeding slowly through the territorial court system, and there was no way to predict when it might be resolved. 2 months after the initial legal challenge, Sheriff Matthews brought news that sent Mabel's heart racing. Marcus Thorne had arrived in Red Dust Crossing and wanted to survey the disputed property personally before the final court hearing scheduled for the following month. "He has every legal right to inspect the land," Sheriff Matthews explained. "But I wanted to give you advance warning, so you could prepare yourself. This Thorne fellow strikes me as the type who might try to intimidate you into settling out of court." That evening, as Mabel and Boone discussed this latest development, she found herself wrestling with emotions she thought she'd resolved years ago. The ranch represented more than property or financial security. It was her connection to Henry, the tangible proof of the life they'd built together. "I've been thinking about something," she said as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Maybe I should take off my wedding ring." Boone looked surprised. "Why?" "Because I realized I've been holding on to it as a way of staying connected to the past, to a life that's already over." She twisted the simple gold band she'd worn for 18 years, feeling its familiar weight. "Henry's been gone for 3 years, and I think it's time I admitted that he's not coming back." "Mabel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She slipped the ring off her finger, holding it in her palm. "Not because I'm forgetting him or dishonoring his memory, but because I'm ready to stop living in the past and start building a future. Our future." The gesture was small but profound, representing her final acceptance of the new life she was creating with Boone. That night, she placed Henry's ring in the box with his photographs, tokens of love that would always be treasured but no longer needed to define her daily existence. 3 days later, Marcus Thorne, arrived in Red Dust Crossing with all the subtlety of a summer thunderstorm. He was a man in his 60s, rail-thin and sharp-featured, with the calculating eyes of someone who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. His expensive suit and polished boots marked him as a city man, but his bearing suggested someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than negotiation. He appeared at the ranch without warning, accompanied by a surveyor and two men who looked more like hired muscle than legal representatives. Mabel met them at the front gate, with Boone standing quietly behind her, close enough to offer support, but far enough back to let her handle the confrontation on her own terms. "Mrs. Hart, I presume," Thorne said, without bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Marcus Thorne, and I'm here to inspect my property." "Your alleged property," Mabel corrected firmly. "Until the court rules otherwise, this is still my ranch." Thorne smiled without warmth. "Enjoy that illusion while you can, madam. I have documentation proving my family's claim to this land goes back to 1862. Your husband's purchase was based on fraudulent paperwork from a corrupt land agent. Then let the court decide. Until then, you're welcome to look around, but you'll do it with respect for the fact that this is my home." For the next hour, Thorne and his surveyor tramped across the property, taking measurements and making notes while his hired men followed at a distance. Mabel watched from the porch, her hands clenched into fists as this stranger catalogued her life's work like a merchant inventorying goods. When Thorne returned to the house, his expression was smugly satisfied. "Nice operation you've built here, Mrs. Hart. The improvements alone must be worth several $1,000s. Of course, any enhancements to my land become my property once the court confirms my ownership." "That's quite an assumption, Mr. Thorne." "Not an assumption, a certainty, but I'm not an unreasonable man. I might be willing to offer you compensation for your improvements, provided you don't drag this matter through an expensive legal battle." Boone stepped forward then, his presence suddenly commanding despite his quiet manner. "What kind of compensation?" Thorne looked him up and down dismissively. "And you are?" "Boone Calder, Mrs. Hart's business partner." "Ah, yes, the local muscle. I heard about your little show at the Saloon." Thorne's tone dripped with condescension. "Well, Mr. Calder, I might be persuaded to offer Mrs. Hart $500 for her improvements, plus another $200 for the inconvenience of relocating." The insult of the offer hung in the air like smoke. $700 for a ranch, worth at least 20 times that amount. It was barely enough to buy a small house in town, let alone start over somewhere else. "That's generous," Boone said mildly, his voice giving no hint of the anger Mabel could see simmering in his eyes. "Of course, if your claim is as solid as you say, you won't mind waiting for the court to confirm it before taking possession." "I'm trying to be reasonable here," Thorne snapped. "The alternative is a lengthy legal battle that will cost more than this pathetic spread is worth." "Then I guess we'll see you in court," Mabel said firmly. "Good day, Mr. Thorne." After the men left, Mabel found herself shaking with reaction. The encounter had crystallized everything she stood to lose, not just the ranch itself, but all the memories and dreams it represented. "He's going to win, isn't he?" she asked Boone quietly. "He has money for lawyers, connections in the territorial capital. What do we have? We have the truth. We have documentation of your family's good faith purchase and 15 years of legal ownership. We have improvements and taxes and a community that knows your character." Boone's voice was steady, confident. "And we have each other." That night, unable to sleep, Mabel walked through the house that might soon belong to someone else. She touched familiar objects, the mantel Henry had carved, the rocking chair where she'd spent countless evenings reading, the kitchen table where she'd planned meals and balanced accounts and shared coffee with friends. Each item told a story of the life she'd built here, first with Henry and then on her own. But as she moved through the rooms, she realized something that surprised her. While she would grieve losing this place, she wouldn't be destroyed by it. The strength she'd found over the past 3 years didn't depend on location. It came from within herself and from the partnership she'd built with Boone. The ranch was important, but it wasn't everything. What mattered most was the love she'd discovered, the confidence she'd gained, and the future she was building with a man who saw her worth and chose to stand beside her regardless of what they faced. Standing in her bedroom, looking at the bed she'd shared with Henry and then slept in alone for 3 years, Mabel made a decision that both terrified and exhilarated her. Tomorrow, she would ask Boone to marry her, not because she needed saving or because circumstances demanded it, but because she loved him and wanted to build a life with him, whether they kept the ranch or lost it. The realization filled her with a peace she hadn't felt in months. Whatever happened in court, whatever the future held, she wouldn't face it alone. She'd found love again, deeper and more mature than anything she'd experienced in her youth, and that was worth fighting for, regardless of what else she might lose. The morning of the final court hearing dawned grey and overcast, matching Mabel's mood as she prepared for what could be the last day she legally owned the Double H Ranch. She'd spent the previous week gathering every document related to the property, Henry's original purchase papers, tax receipts, improvement records, anything that might support their case. Boone had arranged for them to travel to the territorial capital together, a day's ride that would give them time to review their strategy one final time. Jake and Tommy would mind the ranch in their absence, carrying on the daily routines that might soon belong to someone else entirely. As they loaded their saddlebags for the journey, Nettie Patterson arrived with a basket of food for the road and enough nervous energy to power a windmill. "I still can't believe this is happening," Nettie fretted, fussing with the contents of the basket. 15 years you've been paying taxes on that land, improving it, building a life there. How can some stranger just waltz in and claim it belongs to him?" "Because the law says he can, apparently," Mabel replied, checking the saddle cinch on her horse one final time. "But we're not giving up without a fight." Boone emerged from the barn leading his horse, his face set in determined lines. Over the past weeks, he'd proven himself not just as a partner in work, but as a true ally in adversity. His quiet strength had anchored her through the worst of her fears about losing everything. "You ready for this?" he asked, his brown eyes searching her face. "As ready as I'll ever be." Mabel mounted her horse, settling into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. "Win or lose, at least we'll know we tried." The ride to the territorial capital took them through some of the most beautiful country in the territory, but Mabel found it hard to appreciate the scenery with so much weighing on her mind. As they rode, Boone shared what he'd learned about territorial land law from his conversations with their lawyer, an earnest young man named David Walsh, who'd agreed to represent them despite the complexity of the case. Walsh says the key issue is whether the original land agent had the authority to sell the same parcel twice, Boone explained as they rested their horses beside a creek. If Thorne's family claim was properly filed and recorded, then Henry's later purchase might be invalid, regardless of good faith. And if it wasn't properly recorded, then our ownership stands, and Thorne gets nothing but an expensive lesson in checking his facts before filing lawsuits. They reached the territorial capital as the sun was setting, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and orange. The town was larger and more bustling than Red Dust Crossing, with wide streets designed to accommodate freight wagons and herds of cattle being driven to the railroad yards. Their hotel was modest but clean, and Mabel was grateful for the chance to wash the dust of the road from her face and hands before supper. As she stood before the mirror in her room, brushing her hair and preparing to change into her best dress for the evening meal, she caught sight of her bare left hand and felt a moment of panic. For 18 years, Henry's wedding ring had been part of her identity, a visible symbol of who she was and where she belonged. Now her hand looked strange and naked, as if she'd lost something essential to her sense of self. But as she flexed her fingers, feeling the freedom of movement without the ring's familiar weight, she realized that removing it had been the right choice. She was no longer Henry Hart's widow, defined by loss and the past. She was Mabel Hart, a woman building a future with the man she loved, regardless of what the courts decided about her ranch. Boone was waiting in the hotel's small dining room when she came downstairs, and the way his eyes lit up when he saw her made her heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. He'd changed into his best shirt and jacket, transforming himself from working cowboy to respectable businessman, though nothing could disguise the quiet strength that marked everything he did. "You look beautiful," he said simply, rising to hold her chair. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." They ordered a simple meal, neither of them having much appetite given the next day's proceedings, but the act of sharing supper in civilized surroundings helped calm Mabel's nerves. They talked about everything except the hearing, the improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, the books they'd been reading, the changes coming to the territory as more settlers arrived. It was over coffee that Mabel finally found the courage to say what had been on her mind for days. "Boone, regardless of what happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest I've known since Henry died. Maybe the happiest I've ever known." He reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "For me too. I have something I want to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, because it's important." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what felt like the biggest risk she'd ever taken. "Will you marry me?" Boone's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, his eyes widening with surprise. "Mabel, I know it's unconventional for the woman to propose, but nothing about our relationship has been conventional. I love you, Boone Calder. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you see possibilities where others see problems. I love how you make me feel like I can face anything as long as you're beside me. Mabel, let me finish." She squeezed his hand, needing to get all the words out before her courage failed. "I'm not asking because I'm afraid of being alone, or because I need someone to take care of me, or because losing the ranch has made me desperate. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you, whether that's on the Double H or somewhere else entirely." Boone set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once I say yes, I'm never letting you go. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Then yes." His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Yes, Mabel Hart, I will marry you. I'll marry you tomorrow if you want, or we can wait until after the hearing, or we can plan a proper wedding with all the trimmings. I don't care about the details as long as the answer is yes." They sealed their engagement with a kiss across the small table, ignoring the amused glances of other diners. For that moment, the uncertainty about the ranch faded into insignificance compared to the certainty of their love for each other. Back in her room that night, Mabel lay awake, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar town beyond her window. Tomorrow would bring the final resolution of the legal challenge that had haunted her for months. She might walk out of the courthouse as the confirmed owner of the Double H Ranch, or she might discover that everything she'd worked for belonged to someone else. But either way, she wouldn't face the future alone. She'd found love again, deeper and more mature than anything she'd known in her youth, and that was worth more than any amount of land or cattle. Whatever the judge decided, she and Boone would build something beautiful together, because that's what people did when they loved each other enough to take on the world as partners. The thought brought her a peace she hadn't felt in months, and she fell asleep with a smile on her face and hope in her heart. The territorial courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and limestone, its tall windows and carved facade designed to inspire respect for the law and those who administered it. Mabel and Boone arrived early, wanting time to meet with their lawyer and review their case one final time before the hearing began. David Walsh was waiting in his small office across from the courthouse, his desk covered with documents and law books that represented weeks of preparation. Despite his youth, he'd impressed them both with his thoroughness and determination to see justice done. "I'll be honest with you," Walsh said as they reviewed the key points of their defense. "Thorne has good lawyers and documentation that appears legitimate on its face. But I've found some discrepancies in his family's original claim that might work in our favor." "What kind of discrepancies?" Boone asked. "Technical ones, mostly. Questions about whether the proper procedures were followed when the claim was filed, whether the required improvements were actually made within the specified time frame." Walsh gathered his papers into a neat stack. "It's not ironclad, but it's enough to create reasonable doubt about the validity of his claim." At precisely 10 o'clock, they entered the courthouse and took their seats in the gallery. Judge Harrison was an elderly man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent making difficult decisions. His reputation for fairness was well known throughout the territory, which gave Mabel hope that their case would be decided on its merits rather than on who had the most expensive legal representation. Marcus Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers in expensive suits, his confidence evident in every line of his posture. He nodded curtly to Mabel when their eyes met, the gesture more condescending than polite. The hearing began with Thorne's lawyers presenting their case. They produced a land grant dated 1862, signed by territorial officials and bearing all the appropriate seals and signatures. They showed survey maps, improvement records, and family documents tracing the Thorne claim back 3 generations. Listening to their methodical presentation, Mabel felt her heart sink. The case seemed airtight, leaving little room for doubt about the legitimacy of Thorne's claim to at least half of her ranch. But when Walsh rose to present their defense, he surprised everyone by focusing not on Henry's purchase, but on the original Thorne claim itself. "Your Honor," he began, "while the plaintiff's documentation appears impressive, closer examination reveals significant irregularities that call into question whether this claim was ever legally valid." He produced a thick folder of documents he'd obtained from the Territorial Land Office. According to territorial law, in 1862, homestead claims required continuous residence and specific improvements within prescribed timeframes. Our research shows that the Thorne family abandoned this property in 1864, failing to meet the residency requirements that would have validated their claim. Thorne's lawyers objected vigorously, but Walsh pressed on. Furthermore, the survey markers referenced in the original claim cannot be located, suggesting that the boundaries were never properly established. Without valid boundaries, there can be no valid claim. For the next hour, the courtroom became a battlefield of legal arguments and documentary evidence. Walsh presented testimony from longtime residents of the territory who remembered the Thorne family leaving during the Indian Troubles of 1864. He showed gaps in tax records that suggested the land had been considered abandoned and available for resale. Thorne's lawyers countered with their own witnesses and documents, but Walsh had clearly done his homework. Every argument they raised was met with a specific rebuttal based on territorial law and precedent. Judge Harrison listened to both sides with the patience of a man accustomed to complex legal disputes. When the arguments concluded, he announced that he would recess for lunch before rendering his decision. Mabel and Boone ate a silent meal at a restaurant near the courthouse, neither of them able to concentrate on food when so much hung in the balance. The morning's proceedings had been more encouraging than expected, but they both knew that legal cases could go either way, regardless of the apparent strength of the arguments. "Whatever happens," Boone said as they prepared to return to the courthouse, "we'll face it together." Mabel nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Together," she agreed. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison wasted no time in delivering his verdict. This case presents a complex question of property law that goes to the heart of how we establish and maintain ownership in our territory. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the court finds that the plaintiff's original claim was never properly perfected under territorial law. Mabel felt her heart stop beating for a moment before resuming at double speed. The evidence clearly shows that the Thorne family abandoned their claim in 1864, failing to meet the residency and improvement requirements that would have validated their homestead. Furthermore, the lack of proper survey markers means that the boundaries described in their documentation cannot be legally established. Judge Harrison looked directly at Mabel. The court therefore finds that Mrs. Hart's title to the disputed property is valid and unencumbered. The plaintiff's claim is denied in its entirety. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and suddenly Mabel could breathe again. She had won. The ranch was still hers, legally and completely. Beside her, Boone squeezed her hand so tightly it almost hurt, but she didn't care. They had won. Thorne's face was thunderous as he conferred with his lawyers, clearly preparing to appeal the decision. But for now, at least, the immediate threat was over. The Double H Ranch belonged to Mabel Hart, and no one could take it away from her. Outside the courthouse, Walsh accepted their congratulations with the satisfied smile of a man who'd proven himself in his first major case. "I have to admit, there were moments when I wasn't sure we'd pull this off," he said. But justice prevailed in the end. As they prepared for the ride back to Red Dust Crossing, Mabel realized that something had fundamentally changed during the months of uncertainty. The ranch was still important to her, but it was no longer the sole foundation of her identity and security. She had found something more valuable than land or cattle. She had found love and partnership and the confidence that came from facing adversity and emerging stronger. The simple gold band that Boone slipped onto her finger as they stood in the courthouse square was nothing like the elaborate wedding ring Henry had given her 20 years ago. It was plain and unadorned, but it represented something deeper than her first marriage had ever achieved. A partnership between equals who chose each other not out of necessity or convention, but out of deep, abiding love. "Mrs. Calder," Boone said, trying out her new name with obvious pleasure. "I like the sound of that," Mabel replied, and kissed her husband as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, bathing them both in golden light. 6 months later, the Double H Ranch, now officially known as the Hart Calder Ranch, as proclaimed by the hand-carved wooden sign that hung above the front gate, buzzed with activity as the community gathered for Mabel and Boone's proper wedding celebration. Their courthouse marriage had been legally binding, but the people of Red Dust Crossing had insisted on throwing them a party worthy of the love story that had captured the entire town's imagination. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the county, from Nettie Patterson's famous apple pies to Jake's surprisingly delicious barbecued beef. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the sound of fiddle music and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. The late autumn air was crisp and clear, perfect for an outdoor celebration that stretched from afternoon into evening. Mabel stood on the front porch of the house she now shared with Boone, watching their friends and neighbors enjoying themselves in the yard below. She wore a new dress of deep blue silk that Boone had insisted on buying for the occasion, saying that his wife deserved to look like the queen she was. The compliment had made her blush like a schoolgirl, even after months of marriage. "Penny for your thoughts," Boone said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of punch and the easy smile that never failed to make her heart flutter. "Just thinking about how much has changed since that day at Murphy's Saloon. If someone had told me then that I'd end up married to the man who lifted me off the ground, I'd have thought they were crazy. And if someone had told me I'd find the love of my life in a dusty cattle town, I'd have said the same thing." Boone handed her a glass and settled his arm around her waist with the comfortable familiarity of a man who no longer had to ask permission for such intimacies. "But here we are." "Here we are," Mabel agreed, leaning into his warmth. The months since their courthouse wedding had been a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. True to his word, Boone had proven himself an equal partner in every aspect of ranch operations, bringing not just financial resources, but genuine expertise and innovative ideas that had already improved their productivity. He'd also brought something else that Mabel had forgotten. She missed the daily pleasure of sharing life with someone who understood both her strengths and her vulnerabilities. Their partnership had evolved naturally from the business arrangement they'd originally discussed to something far deeper and more intimate. They shared decisions about everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation, but they also shared quiet moments over morning coffee, evening conversations about their dreams for the future, and the simple contentment that came from working alongside someone who complemented your abilities perfectly. The legal victory over Marcus Thorne had freed them from the financial pressures that had once threatened to destroy everything Mabel had built. But it had also done something more important. It had proven that they could face adversity together and emerge stronger. The crisis had tested their relationship in ways that normal courtship never could, revealing character traits and depths of commitment that might have taken years to discover under ordinary circumstances. "Mrs. Calder," called Nettie Patterson from the yard below, "you need to come down here and cut this cake before these men eat everything else on the tables." Mabel laughed, recognizing the gentle command in her friend's voice. Nettie had appointed herself unofficial coordinator of the celebration, a role that suited her perfectly and had freed Mabel to actually enjoy her own party. As they made their way down to join their guests, Mabel caught sight of Jake and Tommy standing near the corral, deep in conversation with several other ranchers about improvements to the breeding program. The respect in their voices when they spoke of the changes she and Boone had implemented filled her with quiet pride. They'd built something here that went beyond mere survival. They'd created a thriving operation that was becoming the talk of the county. The wedding cake was a masterpiece, contributed by the wife of the hotel owner in town. 3 layers of white cake with strawberry filling and elaborate sugar roses. As Mabel and Boone posed for the traditional cake-cutting photograph, she found herself thinking about all the celebrations this ranch had witnessed over the years: birthdays, harvest festivals, the simple gatherings of friends and neighbors that marked a rhythm of frontier life. "Make a wish," Boone murmured as they prepared to cut the first slice together. Mabel closed her eyes for a moment, considering what to wish for. She had love, partnership, financial security, and the respect of her community. The ranch was thriving. Her relationship with Boone grew stronger every day, and the future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility. "I don't need to wish for anything," she said finally. "I already have everything I could want." As the sun set behind the rolling hills that bordered their property, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have made a painter weep with envy, the celebration gradually wound down. Neighbors gathered their children and their empty dishes, offering final congratulations and promises to visit soon. Jake and Tommy headed to their respective homes, grinning with the satisfaction of men who'd enjoyed a thoroughly successful party. Finally, Mabel and Boone stood alone in their yard, surrounded by the debris of celebration, but also by the deep contentment that came from being exactly where they belonged. "Happy?" Boone asked, pulling her close as they surveyed their domain. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Mabel replied honestly. "When Henry died, I thought my chance at love had died with him. I resigned myself to a life of independence and solitude, convinced that was all I could expect. And now I know that love isn't limited to one person or one chapter of your life. I loved Henry with the heart of a young woman who thought she knew what life had in store for her. I love you with the heart of a woman who's learned that the best things often come when you least expect them, and in ways you never imagined." Boone's kiss tasted of wedding cake and promises kept, of dreams fulfilled and new adventures yet to come. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and looking forward to the privacy of their bedroom. "Come on, Mrs. Calder," Boone said, sweeping her up in his arms, just as he had that first day at Murphy's Saloon. "Let me carry you across the threshold of our home." As he carried her up the front steps and through the door of the house they now shared, Mabel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a dare born of frustration and pride, evolved through crisis and uncertainty, and culminated in a love that was all the stronger for having been tested by adversity. The carved wooden sign that proclaimed their partnership to the world would weather many seasons, becoming a landmark that travelers would recognize for miles around. Children would grow up hearing the story of the widow who challenged a town to lift her, and the gentle giant who not only accepted the challenge, but claimed her heart in the process. But for Mabel and Boone, the real legacy wasn't the stories people would tell or the sign that marked their property. It was the life they built together, day by day and choice by choice, proving that sometimes the strongest foundations are laid, not in youth and certainty, but in maturity, and the wisdom that comes from understanding exactly what and who is worth fighting for. As Boone carried her across the threshold of their home, Mabel knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with love as their guide and partnership as their strength. It was, she thought with deep satisfaction, exactly the kind of happy ending that made all the struggles worthwhile. The Hart Calder Ranch would prosper for generations, but its greatest success would always be the love story that began with a simple challenge and grew into something that proved the best. Partnerships are built not just on strength of arm, but on strength of heart, commitment, and the courage to believe that some things are worth lifting up and holding on to forever.